Good morning, everyone. Very happy to be with you all again. It feels like it's been a little while and that it hasn't been that long. Like I can easily remember the last time, but at the same time, I know that actually some time has passed since last time I was here. I guess Hashimoto Sensei has been coming down. I hope you've been enjoying his presence and his offering of the Dharma. Today we are celebrating not only the March Shotsuki Hoyo, but also Ohigan, as April was mentioning. I agree. It seems here on, what is this, March the 8th? To me, it doesn't quite feel like spring yet. We aren't quite at the equinox yet, but I'm glad that people have gathered. I'm not going to have a spring-themed Dharma talk because it just doesn't quite feel like we're there yet. I'm told that last month the local groundhog, what's his name? Something. Does anybody remember the name of that groundhog? Yeah, Wyerton Willie. That's the one. I was remembering Willie. Okay, all right. So Wyerton Willie apparently last month came out, didn't see his shadow, therefore predicted that we would soon have winter ending. And then we had this big, cold front that came in. It got so cold, coldest we've been all year, right? And so actually the local paper said that the police had issued a warrant for Wyerton Willie for defrauding the public with a false prediction. I think, though, because the groundhog was back in his burrow, they didn't manage to actually arrest him and he got away with it. But certainly it got pretty cold and it still feels like we're not quite there yet. Even though I was pleased that we had a relatively sunny morning driving in. That was quite nice. I can certainly tell you that in Waterloo, where I live, I've been shoveling so much this year. Like for real, the snow accumulated at the end of my driveway where I've thrown it up. I mean, it's way higher than me. So yeah, although it's come down a bit because we had some sun. Anyways, I didn't come here to talk about my snow shoveling trails. Actually, what I want to do is share with you a talk, a teaching actually that I received during my time in Hawaii. Many people are aware that I spent a lot of time out there doing research with the Jodo Shinshu community there, spent some time on sabbatical most of a year with my family there a few years back and so on. So this is a teaching I'm bringing back from my time there, and it's from Reverend Tatsuo Muneto, who's the retired Nimban of the Honolulu Betsuing. A lot of words people may not know in that sentence there, so just to be clear, a Betsuing is a special temple with a sort of higher than normal status, which administers a bunch of other temples sort of under its purview. And Nimban is the head, the chief minister of a Betsuing. This is a position with prestige and a lot of work connected to it. We don't have any formal Betsuing here in Canada, but there are several in the United States. I think there's some in Brazil too, and obviously in Japan. There's various of them regionally. So Reverend Muneto, he's one of the most senior Jodo Shinshu ministers outside of Japan. I don't know if people here in this part of Canada really know him all that well because he's spent his career out there in Hawaii. And he hasn't promoted himself. He hasn't written sort of famous books or anything like that. So he may not be as well known. But in Hawaii, he's been working tirelessly to share the Dharma with the Sangha there for over 50 years. And this be, risen to many of the most important positions in their Sangha. And I've known him for at least a decade, probably longer. So this teaching that he shared, it relates to an important difference that he talked about between Jodo Shinshu and other forms of Buddhism. He said that in most Buddhist traditions, everybody follows a certain teacher or a certain guru, and that person acts as a model. That teacher often has a fairly strong authority over other people, or at least over the direction of how the temple or the tradition is run. And your goal as a follower of that teacher is to eventually become like that person. You want to become just like that teacher who is often depicted as being enlightened or relatively enlightened within those traditions. And this is what Reverend Mineta called a model-oriented approach to Buddhism. The teacher is modeling enlightenment to you, and you have to sort of submit and follow what they say in order to make progress so that you can become similar to how they are. Now, Reverend Mineta contrasted this with Jodo Shinshu, the particular form of Buddhism, this tradition, which he said is rather than a model-oriented approach, it's an example-oriented approach. He said it's good to have a teacher in Jodo Shinshu, someone that you listen to and learn from. And in fact, you're likely to have many teachers during your lifetime. But in our form of Buddhism, the teacher is not a model, not a model. We respect our teachers and, we listen to them and consider what they say, but we don't think of them as strong authority figures, right? We don't need to obey them in our tradition. And we aren't trying to become just like them. Instead of a model, a Jodo Shinshu minister is an example of Amida Buddha's great compassion working on them in their everyday lives. So they show what it looks like to receive from the Buddha rather than what it looks like to be the Buddha. And this is a difference between a model or an example, as he explained it. So this good teacher acts as an example in the Jodo Shinshu tradition, shows us what it looks like to live humbly with appreciation out of an awareness of the benefits that we receive. They don't set themselves up as a perfect model. In the Tanisho, one of the most important writings about Shinran, he's quoted in there as proclaiming that he doesn't have a single disciple. This is an extremely odd statement for a Buddhist teacher to make, historically speaking. We actually have historical records that show that Shinran actually had many devoted followers during his lifetime. So when he says this, it isn't that no one listened to Shinran and no one learned from his example. That's not what he means. Rather, it's that they're not subject to his authority. And Shinran saw himself as simply an example of someone who is receiving Amida Buddha's compassion. And so, therefore, Shinran did not consider himself to have some sort of special claim on their loyalty or their obedience. It wasn't about him. He's not a model that they're following. He's an example of receiving from the Buddha just like they are as well. Put your attention to the Buddha, not to the human teacher, is what he's saying by saying he has no disciple. It's always been this way with me too, I have to say. I've had many wonderful teachers who shared the Dharma with me over the years. The most important of whom would be probably Dr. Taitetsu Uno, who I've talked about in the past, who mentored me as a young Buddhist during my 20s and supported my efforts to go to graduate school. And he taught me by sharing his knowledge, by sharing his example, but he never imagined that I owed him something in return. Now, Reverend Mineta, he trained in clinical pastoral education. And in that training, as part of that, he was asked to identify two people who had had the biggest influence on his life. It was actually a fairly challenging exercise if you really sit down and think about it. And he had to really think it through because this is for an assignment as part of his training. So he thought about it. And upon reflection, he said the first one that he would choose would be his grandmother. She was from Hiroshima, which is one of the most famously devout Jodo Shinshu areas of Japan. Hiroshima, and then further inland, the Aki, area here. So after the atomic bombing in Hiroshima, she worked tirelessly to help guide her temple and help support the Sangha members. There was, of course, tremendous suffering that people directly in her temple and amongst her neighbors all experienced together. And this was incredibly hard work that she did. And naturally, sometimes she would run into an obstacle that really bothered her. And with all this work and trying to take care of so many people, when she encountered a difficult situation, sometimes her temper would flare up. And she might snap at somebody who she thought was getting in the way. As Reverend Mineta describes her, she was really quite a formidable woman who could scare people with the force of her will. the sort of person that you needed in that post-war situation to help take charge and lead everybody through such a hard situation. But at the same time, it can be difficult to be such a person, or difficult to work with such a person. So he related, because he grew up around her, he's from Hiroshima as well, that sometimes she would snap at people in the course of getting the work done during the day. But when this happened, then later in the evening, back at home, as a boy, Reverend Minetto would hear her in the other room, sitting in front of the Butsudan there at home. He would hear her, and she would say out loud, but sort of talking to herself or talking to the Buddha through the working with the Butsudan, she would say, "How shameful I was." She would sort of recriminate herself. She'd say, sort of reflecting, she would say, "How shameful I was, how shameful this was." And she would hang her head in regret. He would kind of peek in and kind of spy on this. But after this, soon after that, she would raise her head and she'd say, "How grateful I am, how grateful." And then she would just start repeating the Nembutsu over and over again. Namandabu, 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 like this, and like her whole demeanor would change as he described it. This was his grandmother's Shinjin. This is what he was observing. Sitting before the Butsudan, she would realize how wrong that she had been, and then she would express her regret. She would come to realize this, and she would feel regret, and she would express it. And then as she felt bad, she would remember that her ability to see her shame was itself due to the light of the Buddha shining on her. So she would feel the presence of that light and express her gratitude and say, "Namandabu, namandabu, namandabu," in this way. This is part of the Jodo Shinshu tradition, that just free expression. Oh, you come to realize you've been bad. You don't hide it. You don't squash it. Say, "I've been bad." You just naturally express this naturalness, right? And then you realize, despite being bad, I am embraced by the compassion of the Buddha, and is the wisdom light of the Buddha that allows me to see how I have been in the first place. And so you begin to feel grateful, and you don't hide that or squash that. You just say, "How grateful I am." Namanda, namanda. This is the tradition of naturalness that Jodo Shinshu talks about. And so in this way, she was an important example for her grandson and for others in the temple community. Not because of all the amazing work that she did as a leader of the temple. Her true example, the reason that he chose her as one of the two to talk about in his assignment, was because of her self-realization, her humility, and her gratitude. This was the example that she provided. And then the other person whom Reverend Minetto listed as a great example in this assignment was his primary school teacher in Hiroshima, Mr. Kagawa. As Reverend Minetto described him, Mr. Kagawa was a kind and a generous teacher. He was somebody with a strong interest in his students, while Reverend Minetto was a child growing up and attending his primary school. And later on, Reverend Minetto read some writings by Mr. Kagawa about his sort of teaching experiences, teaching philosophy. And Reverend Minetto was deeply influenced by reading those writings later on. They really helped him to think about how he, as a sort of teacher, also wanted to operate. And one of the stories that really struck him, really stayed with him, was a particular story Reverend Minetto told in his writings about a boy who had been a problem student in class. This kid was disruptive in the classroom and seemed to show no real motivation to learn. So he was a problem student, right? But Mr. Kagawa, his sort of philosophy of teaching, he believed that in paying attention to the emotional needs of his students, and not just forcing the curriculum down their throats, which was frankly a kind of common form of Japanese education at that time, he thought that paying more attention to their emotional needs was an important part of being a teacher, and not just delivering the lecture content, the textbook content, this sort of thing. So he dealt with this situation of this problem student by watching closely what was going on, by talking with that student, and learning what factors might be leading to their troublesome behavior. Mr. Kagawa learned through this process that this boy was being highly pressured at home about his schoolwork, and that when he was disciplined for problems at school, then this led to even greater disapproval at home. And so the boy was under a lot of strain. He wasn't really able to deal with this in an appropriate manner. You know, he was a young kid just in primary school. And so he was acting out because of this. He was bullying some classmates and acting out as a way of releasing the pressure and ignoring the teachings and so on. All these problems were because he had no way of understanding a better way to try to handle the situation. So Mr. Kagawa did not respond by disciplining him as the boy had received in the past when he acted out. Instead, he demonstrated to this boy that he cared about him, and he worked with him over time to teach him how to become a loving and understanding person who could sympathize with others, who instead of seeing someone who was having problems and then perceiving them as maybe weaker, therefore vulnerable, and bullying them in order to feel better about himself, learning to see someone who was having problems, perceiving them as someone like him who also had problems, therefore having sympathy and drawing closer to that sort of person. And this approach worked. The boy's behavior problems went away, according to Mr. Kagawa's summation. So the interesting thing is that later on, when Reverend Munetto was in his middle age, he went back to Hiroshima on a visit, and he sought out his old teacher, Mr. Kagawa, and he thanked him for the positive role that he had played in so many young lives, including his own, right? And he mentioned the story of the problem boy. He said, oh, you know, that was one thing that really stood out to me. And, you know, I really thought about that a lot. Whatever happened to that kid, you know, I hope everything went well. So Mr. Kagawa smiled, and then he just nearly said, that was you. That had been him. Yeah. So Reverend Munetto was just floored by this sort of revelation. He had no idea that that story that he'd been thinking about was about himself. So, you know, he regretted the pain that he had caused people, you know, over 30 years ago. But it also made him even more grateful for the loving kindness that had been shown to him by the example that Mr. Kagawa had presented to him in his life. He, a bad boy who picked on others and didn't do his schoolwork, didn't do anything to earn or deserve the sort of kindness he received, but received it nonetheless and was transformed. So it was this care that Mr. Kagawa showed that transformed this boy into the kind of person who would grow up to be a dedicated Buddhist teacher and give back to the community for over 50 years at this point. So I was really moved when I heard about that story, and I'm grateful for Reverend Munetto for sharing it. And I'm grateful for all the great examples that I've had who've shown me the presence of the Buddhist compassion working in my own life as well. Hopefully you're able to think of some examples also from your own lives about people who've been good teachers, good examples to you. Hopefully still have some, and we can do our best to also try to be examples for others. That's the Dharma message which I wanted to share with you for this Ohigan service. Thank you very much. Why don't we put our hands together in Gasho and just say the Nembutsu to end our Dharma talk. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namandas. 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 Thank you so much, everyone.